And we're back. Episode 3, the Argentine Prison Museum in beautiful Buenos Aires. We left off with this image of San Pedro, who is overseeing, if you will, perhaps even giving his blessings to the correctional institution, suggesting that these prisons are divinely ordained and are part of a larger repertoire of punishment, reform, and control. But it seems to be a benevolent message. Order is expressed in the model. The prison has been viewed historically as a model for social order. So, let's move on. And here we are, walking down the corridor. Now, one of the other aspects of museum studies is to deliver poetics, little plaques, little posters that offer visitors a little nugget of wisdom. And along this corridor, there are these little nuggets of wisdom, citing Shakespeare and citing Thomas Aquinas and San Martin, the so-called George Washington of Argentina. And these poetics deliver these personal but enlightening, uplifting messages. So even though we are inside a punitive environment to some degree, we are also in an environment of reform, of bringing people from point A to point B to point C, which would be back into the community. But the architecture is very interesting because we see that it appears to have been retrofitted. This is my interpretation of architecture of this interior. These gates seem to have been added after the fact. I think this was a smooth corridor without any obstruction. That's just my sense of interiors. So here we see these bars and so on and so forth. It's also quite possible that they were added after 1978. 1978 is when Mother Superior and her team of sisters were relinquished of their authority, and the state, actually the last dictatorship, took over this institution. More about that later. And here we have a very interesting, very eclectic space. Now, officially this room, which is the office of the director, is not part of the exhibit. The door of the office remains open. However, there is a velvet rope that keeps visitors from entering this particular room. So it has this almost liminal quality in that it's not quite part of the exhibit because you can't come in here if you're a visitor, but you're allowed to stand at a distance and gaze. And there's so much going on here. Now, last episode I talked about a story within a story. Well, here is the story within the story, which has a story within that story. So Melissa and I were at the edge of this room looking in and speaking to each other in Spanish, and I obviously speak Argentine Spanish with a North American accent. That's no secret. But Melissa has a very distinct accent, her own. And that caught the attention of the director. And the director is this elderly man who was very polite, a gentleman. I just can't emphasize that enough. And he slowly got out of his chair behind his desk, and he approached the both of us. And we're standing behind the velvet rope. And then he lifted the velvet rope and invited us in and directed his attention to Melissa. And he asked, "Where are you from?" And she says, "I am from Venezuela." Uh-huh. Now he says to her, without even making eye contact with me, he says, and who's this guy? And she says, he's a criminologist from New York. I said, oh, okay. And what do you do? She says, I am a criminologist from Venezuela. Uh-huh. So he began this very engaging conversation with Melissa, and I was kind of locked out of the conversation, not linguistically, but just in terms of being left on my own, sitting in this chair to the right, which was fine because it allowed me to really absorb all these items. And let me explain what I observed, which is captured in this photograph. We see a lot of religious, socio-religious, church and state, the Argentine flag. We have over here the church organ. We also have, in this corner, a display case with a sword. And this is a military helmet, which is now repurposed as a lampshade. And I'm seeing all these socio-religious semiotics, and I'm really taking it in. So I'm not bothered by the fact that I'm not part of this conversation at all. I'm doing my sociology. I am absorbing all of these knickknacks and these paintings, all of these artifacts, and so on and so forth. Well, here's the next story within the story. Here we are. I'm talking to you in year 2020, September 2020. We're still in lockdown, pandemic, etc., etc. And you should know that when Melissa and I were doing field work in Argentina, it was also during a lockdown, a flu epidemic in that part of the southern cone of Latin America. So schools were shut down, the theater district was shut down, music venues were shut down, and this building is a public institution, and that was locked down. And I wanted to get back into this prison museum to do my field work and to take more photographs and so on and so forth, but we couldn't because it was closed. So we were kind of riding out this pandemic in Buenos Aires, and I finally had the idea to ask Melissa to call the institution and to see if they were open. And they said, no, we're still closed for another few more weeks, maybe another month. And we waited another week, and I said, okay, Melissa, here's the plan. Call the prison museum and ask for the director. He will recognize your accent. And ask him if we can come and visit the prison museum. And sure enough, he's on the phone, and she's laughing, he's laughing. He can't believe that she's talking on the phone to him, and he's very enamored, obviously. And she says, you know, can Michael and I come to the prison museum? And he says, well, of course. When? She asked me, when can we go? I said, tomorrow. She says, what time? I said, 11. So at 11 o'clock the next morning, we take a taxi to this prison museum, and the director's waiting for us outside, escorts us in and says, you can do whatever you like. We were the only people in this prison museum for long days at a time. So that's the story within the story, and that's just kind of how we experience prison museums. There's always something unique that happens along the way and helps us remember, helps us to look back fondly on these moments of prison museum exploration. All right, let's keep moving on. Thanks for listening to that story within a story within a story. And you might say to yourself, well, this looks pretty boring. It's just a storeroom full of books. No, anyone who dismisses this room as a storeroom full of books is missing an opportunity. This room, as I gaze at this library, these are law books. These are penal law books that date back to the 1890s. And what this says to me as a sociologist is this is how the state presents itself to the public. The state is a modern institution. They are conveying by this very progressive chronology, library of law documents, that they are as modern as other modern societies. Argentina in the 1880s, 1890s, by the turn of the century, was a dominant force on the world stage. They had rivaled North America. They had also rivaled Europe. They were as advanced in law, medicine, and engineering, not to mention the export economy. They were very much ahead of the curve. And this room seems to document that. And it also seems to, this is a poster that's advertising the prison museum itself. And here we are looking at the Siberia of Argentina. Argentina is the 8th largest country in the world by way of landmass. And the southern edge of Argentina, Patagonia, is very much especially at this time of the turn of the century, was very much being developed by the modern state that was operating within an orbit in Buenos Aires. And now it was reaching out to these regions and developing otherwise undeveloped part of their territory. And so we see that the prisoner is now subjected to hard labor. There's a city in this part of Patagonia that was actually built by the convicts, Ushuaia. And today, visitors go to Ushuaia to really kind of witness how this city was built by convicts. So I'm going to get a cup of coffee and we're going to come back.